First thing I'm going to do is take the wheel off, 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts. Now for this caliper, you can't actually take the caliper off the bracket to start because this slider pin, when you take it out, it'll hit this arm. So what I'm going to do is take the whole caliper with the bracket off and then separate the two once the whole assembly is off. So 19mm socket, remove the 2 bolts that hold this onto the knuckle. There's one right here and then one up above. Okay, now let's do the top one. Now we can take this top one all the way out, and then I'll grab a wrench and do the bottom one, because if you use your socket and ratchet, it will most likely get stuck between the arm and the bolt. All right, the top one's out. Remove the bottom one as well. Take the caliper. Now you can flip it over, and we can take off these 2 14mm bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. All right, 14mm, remove both of these. All right, take this one out. A little trick, if it's stuck like this one is, take your power tool with a wrench in here and use the wrench to pry this out as you're spinning it. Just make sure the wrench is bigger than the thread so you don't ruin them. As you can see, this one's pretty rusty. It's going to need some serious cleaning. But now you can separate your caliper off the bracket. Leave the caliper here, make sure it's not hanging by the brake hose, and let's take this to the bench, clean it, and prepare it for reinstallation. So here's the old bracket. I'm going to be replacing the bracket and the caliper, so you'll see a new one, but I just wanted to mention a few things. First thing is these 2 pins are slightly different, as you can see at the end here. This one I think was supposed to have a little rubber piece here that is clearly long gone. But either way, you want to keep them in the same place that they came from. So this one came from the bottom, this one from the top. And having said that, let's get the pads out. And assuming you're not replacing your caliper, what you want to do, you want to take off these anti-rattle clips here. And you should have new ones. Then you take a wire brush. You want to clean up this area here where these ride. You want no raised rust flakes or rust buildup in here. If you have to scrape it or sand it, do that. And then once that's done, once that's nice and clean, you put a little bit of grease on it, not a lot, just enough to cover it, prevent more rust from building up in the future. Then you would put your new anti-rattle clip on, just like that, press it on all the way. I'll be doing this on the new caliper. And in this case, if your caliper wasn't in this poor of condition and it still had some grease in there, I would just take a rag, wipe off the old grease, and then re-grease the pins. I'll show you how to do that on the new one. It's the same exact thing. In this case, I guess you could clean up the pins and the inside with a bore brush, but everything was so seized, the boots are torn, the caliper is in very poor condition, so that's why I'm replacing it. Let's separate the new caliper from the bracket. Take the pins out, and just like with the other ones, make sure you keep them in their designated area. Take a little bit of grease, and let's grease up these 2 areas here where the anti-rattle clips go. Right here. And press those on, make sure they go on all the way. Do the same to this side. Okay, now I typically like to put a little bit of extra grease right inside the boot because most of what you put on the pin is just going to get washed out when you go to insert it. So this will act as a reserve of grease inside there. Let's do the same thing to the other side. All right, now let's go over to the car. Now it's time to take off the rotor. This one's really stuck on here, and I know it's not the parking brake because it spins freely. If it was the parking brake, then it wouldn't spin. So I'm just going to take a hammer between the lug studs, and hopefully that'll break it free from the hub. Oh, one hit did it. Slide this off. So I have a new hub here. If you still have your old one, of course you want to clean it up and get it as clean as possible. Basically what you're looking for is to have no rust chunks or raised areas, any sort of buildup or debris on it. That way the rotor can sit flush. So use a wire brush, some sort of sanding disc, whatever you have. And then after it's clean, I like to coat it with a little bit of anti-seize. That way it prevents the rotor from sticking on it in the future, and it prevents this from rusting. Don't do a lot, and definitely don't get too much on your brake shoes, because well, you don't want any sort of lubricant on your brake shoes. I installed the rotor backwards just temporarily so I can clean it off with some brake parts cleaner, remove all the oil that is coating the rotor. And of course, don't forget about the inside here where the brake shoes ride. You want this to be free of any oil as well. Now let's flip it over, install it the right way. And let's clean off the front side as well. Once this is clean, I'm actually going to attempt to adjust the e-brake shoes. Now these, you can hear them, they're touching on the head of the rotor. So these are actually perfectly adjusted. However, if you needed to adjust them more in or out, this is the little adjuster wheel that you can spin with a screwdriver or a little pry bar, and it'll either bring the shoes out to tighten them up against the rotor, or bring them in to loosen them. As I said, mine is actually perfectly adjusted still, so I'm going to leave it right where it is. Now you'll see this exposed hole right here. This actually is supposed to have a cover, and my old rotor did not have one. It's a little rubber plug, so I can't install one. But if you have one on your old rotor, definitely take it off, put it on the new one. This will prevent water from getting in here. And the reason for this hole is so you can actually adjust the e-brake shoes without taking the rotor off with a little screwdriver through this hole. I'm going to slide the outer pad in first. Now take the inner pad, and I'm going to position the caliper bracket as if it was mounted on the car, and I want to put this wear indicator on the bottom of the inner pad. So slide that in the correct way. Now take your caliper, put it over the bracket, over the pads. Line up the two slider pin holes, and let's install the slider pins. Thread these on. And if you had your old caliper, if you're still reusing it, you'd have to compress the piston, which I'll show you in a minute how to do that. But for now, I'm going to slide this over the rotor here, and take your two caliper bolts. Take your two caliper bolts and start these on so the caliper doesn't fall off. I'm going to bottom all of them out first, then I'll torque all of them. Nice and snug. Again, I'll come back and torque these. Let's tighten these. Okay, 30 foot-pounds for the slider pin bolts. And 60 foot-pounds for the caliper 2-knuckle bolts. Perfect. So of course I have a new caliper as you saw, but if you were still reusing your old one, you would have to push the piston back to accommodate for the new thicker pads. So you would put an old brake pad in. I'm using this tool that presses the piston back in. You can use something else such as a large C-clamp, some large pliers. Basically you just want to push it back nice and slow until it is completely bottomed out, right about there. Release your tool, and now you would be able to install the caliper over the bracket with the new pads. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, snag them up, and torque them to 83 foot-pounds. 83 foot-pounds.